Hey, it's Tim here. In today's video, we're carrying on the push to understanding Tableau server. In the last video, I did a Tableau server install. I've also done a video on security with Tableau server and how to set up things like permissions. But in this video, I want to dig back into Tableau server, the architecture itself, and talk about Tableau server processes. Now, these are super important because they fundamentally control the way Tableau server works. But one of the things you have to do, or you had to do in the previous Tableau server exams, is understand each of these server processes and even have an intimate knowledge of how to troubleshoot by understanding which process does what and how to troubleshoot where the problem actually is. And it reminded me of a visualization on Tableau Public that I think can help explain this in a much better way than even Tableau's own documentation. Let's get stuck in. Okay, so like anyone studious, of course, everything starts with a Google search. So if you actually go and search Tableau server processes, you do get this documentation here. And when you click on that, it actually takes you to a page that essentially explains the processes. Now, the problem with Google search recently is that the Tableau platform has changed a lot. And at the moment, the ranking of specific links sometimes links to maybe not necessarily the best landing page for you to understand that topic, because of course Tableau have changed these pages over time. So when you land on the Tableau server processes, it starts to talk about license services, and then it starts to break them down. But in reality, given the way that licensing works today, whether the process is licensed or not actually matters a lot less, especially if you're working with something like the Tableau Cloud, where you're using a completely different licensing model in relation to this. The other thing is that this sort of tabular breakdown of the processes, whilst it's useful, whilst it does explain exactly what the processes do, it doesn't show you the interplay and the interrelationships between these processes, which is actually quite important when it comes to troubleshooting. Let's say something has gone wrong with authentication and you're trying to upload a workbook. How do you troubleshoot where in the flow something has gone wrong? And so when you start to sort of learn Tableau server in general, one of the big challenges is you start to dig into all this documentation. You have to sort of build this mental mind map of what's going on. And eventually you get to pages like this, which show you diagrams of how the individual nodes work. And there's actually sort of a couple of images that really speak to this. The first one is this particular one, which you'll typically see in TSM. And this one actually has a sort of a reduced list of processes. And actually, if you go back a few years in terms of Tableau, some of these processes didn't even exist. And if you go even a bit deeper, you do get even more processes that are being added onto the system as the architecture and the platform grows, and as we get new features like, for example, prep scheduling and the ability to schedule flows in the Tableau Cloud or on Tableau server. And so it's really important to actually understand how these all come together. Now, one of the best places, one of the best resources I used when I passed my previous Tableau Server Certified Pro exam was actually this Tableau Public resource. And this is a resource that's on Tableau Public. I'll actually put a link in the description. I'll put it as the first link in the first comment of this video as well. But you can see that this is actually a really nice resource for two reasons. Number one, this was actually uploaded by Technical Product Marketing. This was back in 2018, and they've updated it until February 2020. So it's sort of not been updated recently, but actually for the bulk of what you need to learn, this is still functional. And obviously we could maybe put in a community effort to update this. If you'd like to do that, let me know in the comments and we'll get something going maybe on GitHub with the data source, and we can kind of work on it together as a community. But nonetheless, it has a really nice setup here, because what you can do that you can't really do easily in the documentation is you can choose a flow. So for example, let's say that I want to publish a workbook. I'll go ahead and select that. You'll see that the visualization clears itself and it wants me to choose a step 2. Over in step 2, it wants you to ask, well, are you publishing this workbook with an extract or with a live connection? If I select a live connection, then you'll see that it brings the architecture diagram back. But where this tool comes into life, where it really, really works well, is if we drag the slider all the way to the right, essentially what that slider does is it steps through the individual processes required to publish that workbook. So you can see here the first step here, Tableau Desktop generates thumbnails for the workbook, then requests to upload the workbook and sends a .twbx file. Step 2, the gateway passes the request through the application server. Step 3, the application server processes the request and sends it as XML to store in the repository. Number 4, the repository stores the set thumbnails and the workbook XML. Number 5, the application server creates the publish workbook results dialog window. That's what you see in desktop itself. The gateway sends the response to the user. And number 7, the publish workbook results dialog window is displayed to the user. And don't forget, this is with a live connection. And so if we just go back, now that I've sort of explained this to you, if we just bring this all the way back, let's bring it back to step 1. I think this is the very first step here. You can see that it starts out, and on the left, it's actually showing you the flow through the architecture on the left-hand side. So if I step this from step 1, obviously we start over here on the left with the client. If we go to step 2, you see it draws an arrow to the next most logical step in the flow, which is the gateway. This is pretty much where all internet communication comes in. Step 3, it goes from the gateway to the application server. The application server essentially runs the Tableau server in essence. And then from step 4, it goes to the next step where it basically starts to break the workbook up into its constituent components. It takes the XML and puts that into the repository. It also takes the connection details and saves that where it needs to. And if we were doing an extract, there'd be some additional steps that I'll show you in a second. The application server creates a publish workbook results dialog window. This is basically sending the request back. If I click back on my face there, we'll get this out of the way. And it basically keeps going through. So I've gone through this once, you kind of get the idea. Now, the great thing here is we can actually see the difference if we were to change this to a extract. So if we go to an extract, you'll see that it's actually got more steps. It's got 10 steps in total. If we go all the way to the right-hand side, you'll see there's actually a few additional steps. And the few additional steps, the things that are different about this, if we just let this sort of drop there, I didn't actually let go of the clicker there, is that you've actually got the process of getting the data out of the extract, essentially splitting that from the workbook and putting that into the file store. The extract essentially lives in the file store. And so when you publish a workbook, a packaged workbook, it takes out the workbook, turns that into XML, puts that in one place, takes the data and puts it somewhere else. And then that's the way essentially everything works. Now, this is of course just one flow. You can try different flows here. So let's say you want to access a view, you want to go look at something in Tableau. Well, if I go ahead and I choose the different type of views that I can access, I can look at a cached view, an embedded extract, embedded live connection, external files, whatever I'm looking at. Let's look at a cache view here and just see the impact that caching has. If I go to the right-hand side here and we start again, I can just drag the slider over here to the right-hand side. And you see that it breaks this down. Step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. You get the idea. This is a much better tool for looking at how the processes work, because what you start to realize is there are some processes that are just fundamental in pretty much every part of the flow. And if you're having issues in those particular parts of the Tableau architecture, you're going to have issues with Tableau in pretty much most instances. And so when you're troubleshooting, it's really important to have this sort of general awareness. Now, it's also impossible to remember all of this off the top of your head. It's only through experience do you actually start to remember these things. For a while, I worked a lot with Tableau Server, and some of this was just, at the back of my hand. I haven't used it a lot recently, so some of it's just left my head. So I'm trying to get back into this and trying to re-understand these flows and make sure they work a lot better. But there's also some changes to this. There'll be elements of this diagram that are no longer correct. So one thing you can do is also try and look at this and start critiquing this and trying to make sense of new processes, finding out what those new processes are, what they do, and how that might impact the way this flow works. So I just wanted to make a really brief video about this tool. I'll put a link to it again in the description so you can find out. I'm going to make a separate video maybe about the processes. That would be a slightly longer video, but I just wanted to call out this particular resource because I think it's one of the best resources for doing this. And I think if you're learning Tableau Server, there's less and less people learning Tableau Server because, of course, Tableau Cloud is becoming more prominent. And so resources like this are coming far and few between. And so if we don't have things like this, I think we as a community have to sort of stand up and try and perpetuate these resources so they exist a little bit more in the community. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.